Welcome back to the Mind of Sai Marie, everyone. Today, I'm joined by the remarkable guest whose life reads like a cinematic epic, Chester L. Richards, who is the author of The Trek Continues, a memoir that chronicles a life of adventure, heartbreak, and resilience, from co-writing a Star Trek episode, which is pretty cool, to surviving near-death experiences and personal loss. Chester's story is a testament to the human spirit and the power of curiosity. Chester, it's an honor to have you here today, and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so very much. It's a pleasure.
Before we get started with my questions here, would you like to give us a little, in your own words, introduction?
Introduction. Well, I'm 83 years old, so I have had a long and exceptionally interesting life. At least from my perspective, it was interesting. And I've been writing for a very long time, as it turns out, off and on. But only recently have I been publishing the stories that we'll be talking about. Educational background, I have degrees in physics and graduate experience in engineering as well. And professionally, I was an engineering physicist. I have a lot of inventions. I was trained as a professional inventor as well.
That's incredibly impressive. And might I add, for 83, you look young and vigorous and full of life. So whatever you're doing, you must be doing it right.
Thank you. I think I had very good parents. They both lived to much older age than I am right now.
So, what first inspired you to write The Trek Continues?
Well, this is the second book of a trilogy. The third book is actually written, but it hasn't been edited as yet. First book was published a couple of years ago, but it was the result of a long process, which started when my wife passed away, which is almost 20 years ago now. And I started writing the stories as a means of recovering from that terrible experience of losing my wife. If you haven't had such an experience, there's no description. It's pure hell. If you have had the experience, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what happened was that when I was writing the eulogy for the funeral, I found that it lifted my spirits a little bit to talk about my dear Sarah, and just putting words down on paper. Well, it's on paper. It's on the screen of a computer just as much. But just writing the words out helped me a little bit. And so as I got to thinking about things in the days after the funeral, I just decided, I'll just start writing stories and write them as if they were letters that I was writing to Sarah. And so I wrote one story. I don't even remember what it was now. And I climbed one step, and I wrote another story, and I climbed a second step. And I continued writing stories, and I gradually walked up a staircase that took me back, not to where I was before, but to a different life where I had some equilibrium and I could get on with living life and enjoying and laughing, basically being back among the living. So basically, I'm still in purgatory, but I'm getting closer and closer as the years pass to getting to heaven. And maybe that's a couple of 3 years off. We'll see.
So, it sounds like that was a pretty emotional journey. I was going to ask you, what were some of the biggest emotional and creative challenges you faced in telling the story?
There really wasn't any emotional traumas involved in telling the stories. I found I entertained myself and I entertained my listener. See, the way I write a story is I write as if I'm telling the story to somebody in front of me. Now, obviously, I have to look at a computer screen, but I imagine there's somebody sitting at one side of the computer screen or in the immediate presence that is looking over my shoulder as I'm typing out the words. But that's the way I write, is I basically just tell a story. And of course, there's all the technical stuff, like you never get it right the first time. You get the ideas down and then walk away and come back, and you're a different person after 2 days, and you come back and reread the story and say, oh, my goodness, I did that. But that's really bad. I got to fix that. Things of that sort, So it's a process. But what ultimately comes out of that is something that's fairly polished and something you can live with, and you can then send out to the rest of the world to either entertain or have them dump all over you because they don't like it. But so far, everybody says they like my stories. So I guess I'm doing something okay.
Well, that's always great to hear. How did your worldview shape the way you chose to tell the story?
Just, I don't know. I'm very visual and I have an extremely good memory. So all I do is I relive the experience and I just write it down.
That's relatable. I feel the same way in my approach to storytelling. So, how did co-writing a Star Trek episode influence your approach to storytelling in life?
Well, I don't know how it influenced my life, but I will. Well, it had a major impact on my life because it was a great success. But how did it influence me? Ultimately, it taught me that I could write. You have to understand. So when I was young, my parents moved around from city to city. So I went from school to school. And the school systems, I'm in California right now, and school systems in California were very interesting. They had social studies one year and English the next. So I got 6 or 7 straight years of social studies and no English class. I had no clue how to put words down. And by the time I got to high school, of course, they assumed you already knew how to write a sentence. And so they got into this arcana of diagramming sentences with dependent clauses and all the rest of that stuff. I had no idea what the teachers were talking about. So I faked my way through high school. I got to college, and you had to take a written exam on entry to the university. And of course, I flunked it. And so I had to take subject A. So that taught me where periods go, what periods are for, and what commas are for, and how to divide a sentence and write English. Okay. So the whole idea of becoming a professional writer and writing books and selling stories and things of that sort, there's no way in the world I grew up thinking that I was ever going to do such a thing. But it does happen. Now, I was fortunate. My first job after I got my bachelor's degree, I was inducted into a group of professional inventors, which was a remarkable benefit. It almost never, something like that almost never happens to you. But we had in that group, because we wrote a lot of technical proposals, so writing was a big part of what we did in that organization. So the group had hired a retired editor who had been an editor at Time magazine. And she took one look at the mess that I was putting on paper and says, no, 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 no. Here's how you do it. So I got trained by an editor from Time magazine as to how to actually write stuff. And that was before my experience getting involved with the Star Trek and subsequent writing. So I did have that amount of professional grooming. Also had an extremely good course as an undergraduate in classical rhetoric, just an absolutely superb course. So I knew how to organize my thoughts. It's just I needed the editor to teach me how to unscramble a sentence and make things that people could actually understand what the heck I was putting on paper.
Wow, that's a really incredible opportunity to be able to get that kind of hands-on training with a Times editor. So,
Yeah.
um, that's just awesome to hear. So, what draws you to the edge of experience? Scientific travel, exploration, survival?
I don't know. I think it's in my heritage because I come from pioneering families on both sides. I'll start with my mother's family. My grandparents on my mother's side were both born in Sicily. They were immigrants to the United States. And my mom grew up in that kind of a household. And of course, I knew my grandparents, but they lived on the other side of the country from me. So I didn't have much of a contact with them, although I did live with them for a few months. I lived with them long enough to learn to speak Sicilian, by the way, which I promptly forgot as soon as I left. So that was on my mother's side. So obviously, I come from a pioneering family on my mother's side. But then on my father's side, it's much more interesting. From an American's perspective, it's more interesting because I have ancestors on the Mayflower. Governor Bradford in Plymouth Colony was a direct ancestor of mine. And so I have pioneering ancestors going all the way back to 1610. And my great grandfather, one of my 2 great grandfathers on my father's side, was a scout on a wagon train. It came across on the Oregon Trail. The other great grandfather was a pioneer and had a ranch in Nebraska. And his first son from his first marriage, his wife deceased, was a sheriff of a Nebraska county, actual Wild West sheriff. So I grew up on my father's side in a family of true pioneers. There is on the West Coast a major highway that runs from Mexico all the way up to Canada, and it's I-5, Interstate 5 highway. And it turns out one of my great grandfathers was the guy who cut open through the forest and pioneered the section of what is now I-5 through the forest section of the state of Washington. So that's the kind of pioneers I come from. And of course, my dad inherited that, and I think he passed a substantial amount off to me. He was, during the Depression, things didn't go well. He was a ranch hand for a while, and then he hopped a freight, was a hobo for a while, worked his way back east, and joined the Air Corps when Hitler went into Poland. And Dad decided that we were going to get into the war sooner or later. So he decided that it better to get in early and get some rank, which he did. And that's where he met my mom back east on the street corner across the street from the New York Library. Both my dad and my mother were avid readers. So that's where they met. And so that's how you get a Yankee hooked up with a Sicilian. It's a classical American story. I mean, a guaranteed American mongrel, a member of the American mongrel horde.
So, how do you balance the mythic with the mundane in your writing?
My stories are all true stories. There is no myth. It's the way you write the story that makes it mythical, because people will say, oh my God, it couldn't possibly have happened that way. And yet all I'm really doing is transcribing. In many cases, I actually wrote a daily journal, and a lot of the books are drawn from the daily journal. So I literally wrote the stories within hours of the events happening. Other occasions, I just have a very good visual memory. So I just relive the experience and write down what I remember, what I'm reliving. And I guess I do it in such a way with an appropriate touch. I try and keep a light touch. And try and keep humor in the stories, no matter whether they're positive or negative stories. I try and keep the humor in them so that they have an element of myth just in the way I write the stories. But they are true stories. I don't write fiction.
So, this one's a little bit more about craft versus kind of branding and marketing. How does being interviewed compare to crafting your own narratives?
You guys put me on the spot. You ask questions that I have to somehow figure an answer out, like right now. I've had podcasts. I had an earlier podcast today with a guy in Canada. I've had podcasts with people quite literally all over North America and in Europe as well, various countries in Europe. And what I find is I just am meeting interesting people in the process. And so I just get in a conversation with people and we share ideas. Sometimes you guys put me on the spot and I have to figure out some kind of an answer. But other times it's just some friends getting together and having fun.
So, are there any authors, thinkers, or philosophies that inspire your memoir's tone?
Well, that's interesting. When I was thinking about that, I realized that, yeah, there's interesting guys that I pay attention to, but I guess some of them could be controversial. But I have to tell you, I got advice from two different very great authors. One was a scriptwriter, the other was a novelist. And the scriptwriter, who had had many, many television shows and written movies and any number of books, he took me aside one day and he said, just write your passion. Write what you really, really want to tell stories about. And the other guy was a famous novelist. I didn't meet him, but he was a very dear friend of a friend. So I got the message from that. And his message was very simple. He says, keep it simple, tell a story, just tell a story. So when I write stuff, I have to find a balance between writing my passion and keeping it simple and just tell a story. And that to me is the philosophical foundation with which I work.
Well, how do you personally define living a life of meaning?
Well, life of meaning. Just be honest, be true to yourself, don't tell lies.
What do you see as the biggest barriers to living boldly in today's world?
It's hard to say, and I'm an old man, okay? So I've been through almost every kind of trauma you can imagine. I mean, I've been through earthquakes that demolished the house next door. I've been through fires that burned things down and people lost their lives. I've been through a hurricane. I've been through a storm at sea, been through all kinds of things that happen to people. And when you're in the middle of that, you're really busy trying to survive, trying to get through the experience. And of course, there have been interactions with people that have been very unpleasant as well along the way. And illnesses and all that sort of stuff. Things happen to you as you go through life. When you're in the midst of something like that, you're usually too damn busy to just trying to survive and get through it. It's when you look back at it that you can make a decision. One of the decisions is you can let that experience take you down. And unfortunately, a lot of people that happens to, they get taken down by the experience. The other thing is you can say, well, that was an interesting adventure. That was an interesting experience. I'm glad it's over. I wouldn't want to go through it again. But I'm glad in a way I went through it because having had that experience, I look at life a little bit differently and I'm a little bit enriched by having had that experience. It's painful when it happens, whatever it happens to be. But when you're through it and you look back at it, you can use it to lift yourself up instead of drag yourself down.
Yeah, I agree with that. This kind of leads into where I was going to ask next, which is, are there any practices or mindsets to help you stay grounded and open to life's unexpected turns so that you can deal with them when they come?
Yeah, well, I always like to think of life as a series of adventures. And the way I define adventure is anything you do that you've never done before. And it can be very simple. You go to a new school, you go to a new job, you get married. There's a really big adventure there. Your wife dies. That's a big adventure. As long as it's for the first time, it's an adventure. You start doing these things too frequently, it can either be an entertainment or it can really drag you down, one of the two. So you have to be careful as to what you want to re-experience. We prefer to re-experience the things that are pleasurable rather than the things that are less than happy making. So I've lived my life looking at doing new things continuously. And it's been it's been interesting in the career that I had mainly because of two things. Number one, the challenges that I've had in terms of trying to solve certain difficult technical problems. And secondly, the challenge that I've had in dealing with people, sometimes thorny people, but very often people of true genius, and becoming friends with people who are extraordinarily interesting. And I write about these people. I mean, these people have really good stories, and I love to tell the story of dealing with these people and looking at world through their eyes as well as through my own. For example, when I was in graduate school, I worked in the lab of a very famous scientist. And after a while, you get to be friends with your boss and you get tell stories and things like that. Turned out this guy had been a submarine captain in World War II. And so he had really interesting stories to tell about that experience. I wrote that in the first book. I wrote his story in the first book, the story that he told me one day. So, there's people like that you run into. I've run into the people that put us on the moon, for example, work side by side with the rocket engineers that built the Saturn rocket and built the rocket engines for the space shuttle, things of that sort. Those are my friends. They're not names in a book. They are people that I know and spent years getting to know as friends.
So, are you currently working on any special new writing projects or explorations?
Well, the explorations are pretty much gone. I do have one invention that I'm in the process of patenting, which is more or less it's a gift to the world because I don't expect to make any money from it. But it's an interesting new idea. Aside from that, it's basically getting these books out the door. As I say, I've got the second book coming out very shortly in the beginning of October. And then the third book is already written, but it has to be edited. And I'll have to go through that process with my editor, and she'll beat me up an awful lot. And we'll yell and scream at each other for a while and eventually come to some kind of a compromise, and you'll get a good story out of it.
So, if you could sit down with anyone living or gone for a deep conversation, who would it be and why?
Well, obviously, I'd like to have my Sarah back. I mean, she was such an extraordinary person. She's one of the most gifted people that I've ever run into, and I've run into some really talented individuals. So, I mean, we can talk long stories about her gifts, which were enormous. Aside from Sarah and wanting to recover a part of the life that was of great pleasure, I had so many really good friends, colleagues, most of whom have passed on now. And I'd like to dig those guys up out of the ground and sit and talk with those guys for an extended period because I had very close relationships with colleagues and bosses and people of that sort. And these were very gifted people. And it was always a great deal of fun to sit and chat with these guys and explore the world through their eyes as much as my eyes.
Well, I think that's pretty much all of us when we have those amazing connections and you don't understand what you lose until it's no longer there anymore. What advice would you give to aspiring writers and seekers who feel lost in their own trek?
Boy, there's a lot. First of all, you got to write, and then you got to write, and you got to write, and you got to write, and you got to write some more. Think of it this way. If you go to a football game or a basketball game or look at the Olympics or whatever, those athletes are great athletes, but they didn't get to be great athletes the first time they went out. They got to be great athletes partly because they had natural skills, something about their bodies and their minds that allowed them to do these kinds of things. But then they practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. And they practiced against challenges that really were difficult to overcome. And so any writer who's going to be good at all, you just have to practice. So that's the first thing. The second thing is establish boundaries. My wife was a licensed psychotherapist. So this is one of the things that I learned from her. When you write, you can write to yourself and just put the writing aside in a cabinet and forget about it or come back to it, but that's just for yourself. That's one thing. But if you're going to write for somebody else, if you're going to write for publication in any sense of the word, whether you're giving it to family or giving it to friends or publishing into the professional world, you're going to find critics. You can expect to find critics, and you need to establish a boundary that protects you against any negative that you might feel coming your way. So here's what my advice is. Let's say you have a critic that really hates what you're doing. I've been fortunate, by the way. I don't seem to have that, but I can imagine people that are getting highly criticized that way. So here's the way you look at it. The critic is not talking about you. The critic is talking about himself. The critic is revealing himself to you. And you can take it or leave it as you choose.
That is some very key and crucial advice. Thank you, Chester, for joining me today. I can't even convey how powerful someone with your degree of expertise and knowledge coming to share your wisdom is, and I truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Your story reminds us that life is a series of events and it's a quest for meaning, courage, and connection. So, to everyone listening, you can find The Trek Continues wherever books are sold and let Chester's journey inspire your own. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember, the mind is the most powerful story we'll ever tell.
Thank you.
Have a great day.